Sunrise Parabellum, comrades! I'm your host, Kevin Carpenter, and joining me today is the founder of Weaponized Ink and the creator of the Hammer and the Stake role-playing game, Chris Gunning. How are you doing today, Chris?
I'm doing amazing. Thank you very much for having me on, Kevin.
Well, thank you very much for joining me. I'm really excited to talk about this game. You sent it over to me, and I read through it, and I couldn't stop reading through it. It's a really interesting game. I love the design, I love, the world, but also I love, the different, mechanics that you're throwing in there. So before I talk about your game for you, let's go right into it. Chris, tell us, what is the Hammer and the Stake?
Sure. The Hammer and the Stake is a role-playing game about playing socialists in 1920, in Eastern Europe specifically. So post-World War I, the Great War, before the rise of fascism in World War II, you play socialists, revolutionaries, fighting against fascist Dracula. And this isn't a metaphor, it's straight on Bram Stoker's Dracula, as if Dracula arose just before 1920, looked around and decided that the world was not to his liking, and started a proto-fascist revolution in Hungary and Romania. So Dracula creates marginalized, which is Greater Hungary, Nagy being great or greater, and marginalized being hungry in the Hungarian language. And you play socialist revolutionaries who have rejected the vision that Dracula has set forth and are attempting to tear down the institutions that exist in an effort to make sure that there is a brighter future for everybody. Greater Hungary in the setting includes Hungary, Romania, and parts of Serbia at this point, because the Dracula fascist government has invaded other parts of Eastern Europe in an attempt to grab what was originally the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They are trying to recreate portions of this kind of throwback, revisionist, regressivist, ultimately, government ruled by vampires who have this vision where humanity is little more than cattle. Serfdoms are exactly what they want to rebuild and force your characters into that. And your characters reject this. Your characters are going to fight. Your characters are going to stop this from happening.
That's amazing. So we've got this alternate timeline. We have a fascist government, which is run by vampires, which you've said it before in our previous conversations. The metaphors kind of play with themselves there. Can you tell us a bit more, though, about the world of this country, especially where the players come in? Because you mentioned
Sure.
that they're part of this movement that's against the government, but can you give us a little bit more specifics on that?
Sure, happily. So the characters are part of the Carpathian Revolutionary Front, the CRF in English letters versus Hungarian in this case, and it's an affectation that we've got to do because it is largely in English, but we do our best to be as appropriate to the Hungarian and Romanian languages that we pull in. But the CRF, the Carpathian Revolutionary Front, is the conglomeration of a series of socialist factions that have come together under this umbrella. It is a very uncomfortable set of bedfellows who are working together. They're all united by generally Marxist socialist ideals to bring themselves together and motivate themselves both philosophically and physically to be able to confront the Dracula government, what we call the cryptocracy. This cryptocracy exists, it's building the institutions to ultimately tear down the modernist institutions that Hungary and Romania are moving towards. It's a setting that is one part literary. We have Dracula in the truest sense. In this case, Dracula is Bram Stoker's Dracula, I mentioned, but Bram Stoker's Dracula and all the powers that came with Dracula, with the nature of Dracula. Bram Stoker had never traveled to Hungary or Romania before and was kind of making things up in a very literary style. So we embrace that, and Dracula is an imperfect creature, is not necessarily as refined as we see from some of the other iterations of Dracula later on. But this Dracula is ultimately an aristocrat and wants to create a feudal society. That's the regressivism. And if you go back and you look at some of the early Marxist discussions, they're talking about this regressivism. And we have the two come together in this philosophic creation of the setting, where Greater Hungary is trying to revert back to an era where humanity is little better than serfs, little better than chattel slaves that are going to produce for the vampire overlords. But the CRF has rejected this idea. And the CRF, this Carpathian Revolutionary Front, is a conglomeration of a number of different socialist movements brought in and working together. So each one of your characters will select one of the various factions. Some of them come from another literary background or an urban workers background. Some are nationalists. Others are more regional in their approach. But all of them ultimately are socialists, partly because we wanted to come up with a core reason to get the players to come together and to work together, to ingrain into the setting itself a reason for everybody to look to each other and to build on each other's successes. Likewise, with the cryptocracy, with the government that Dracula controls, we wanted to create an organization, a state that needed to be torn down. Not that just kind of should be, or because they get in the way of things. No. The cryptocracy is antithetical to humanity, and it has to be torn down. The institutions have to be confronted. The stormtroopers and the soldiers, the security forces that are working on behalf of the cryptocracy have to be stopped. There is no choice there. So we've built these two structures into the game. One of them being the CRF bringing players together, and another one, the cryptocracy, telling what the players must do.
That's really awesome. Honestly, the different factions of the CRF really caught my eye when I was looking through the book. There was, like the workers union, there's the literati. I think there was also like a faction, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's like religious people who are also trying to get into the occult to fight back against the occult.
Yep, the Society of St. Blaise. So you brought up two of the most popular ones, right? The literati and the Society of St. Blaise. The literati are coming from this deep socialistic, philosophical, literary background. When you get into the history of socialism and the exploration of socialism, there's these deep discourses that are going on by some luminaries with the socialist background, trying to explore what that's all about. And it felt to me as I was developing the game that there had to be an organization like the literati that really embraced these philosophical discussions, the really hard stuff, the evolution of socialism from this kind of literary standpoint, holding salons, having these discussions, these challenges to each other, and evolving socialism and preserving information. In the game, that is what they're doing. The literati are preserving the information, then building the pamphlets and the books that are going to be illegally distributed to keep the flame of modernism literally alive. And then you mentioned the Society of St. Blaise. They're cool too. The Society of St. Blaise was actually an attempt by us to explore a religious faction that wasn't bad, right? In a lot of RPGs, we tend to, especially if it involves like Catholicism, characterize them automatically as bad. And there's a lot of very good real world and modern history as to why that is. But in this case, we didn't want to. We wanted to try to show that religion can play a positive role too. And again, in the history of socialism, some of the earliest socialists were Christians, and the various different versions of Christianity too. There were individuals that were arguing that Jesus himself was ultimately a socialist. And so there was this brand of socialist ideology that was also coming through in the 1920s, in the real world 1920s, and in our fictional version that we wanted to explore. And so that's where the Society of St. Blaise comes from. And the Society of St. Blaise is also our attempt to fully and unapologetically kind of embrace some of the craziness and the weirdness that comes along with faith. And in a world where there are literal vampires and Dracula ruling a government, why not have this? So there is that part of it too. So we've got, the International Workers Union, which are kind of the unionist socialists out there. We've got the literati. We've got the Society of St. Blaise. We've got the Hungarian Socialist Revolution, which is the kind of nationalist Hungarian heart of the CRF. There's a number of different factions that the players can all choose from and find something, but each one of the factions also does something. They take a different part of the fight and they have a different approach to how they are going to rebuild society more positively than the vision that Dracula has.
since we're kind of diving into the mechanics, it's clear that this game has a lot of historical roots and also a lot of roots in socialism. In fact, some have described the central mechanic of the hammer and the stakes as socialist dice rolling. Could you go into more detail about the game's mechanics in that way?
Surely, and socialist dice rolling is a fair characterization. It's also more cooperative, right? So the idea behind the mechanic, the stakes system, is that I wanted to break the tradition where we all have our own dice, we roll them in a corner, and we tell each other what happened, or the GM literally hides behind a piece of cardboard and rolls in secret. And I wanted to break that system. And I looked to Euro games. If you've ever played something like Settlers of Catan, I really love that system where there's one set of dice, you roll that and everybody's paying attention. You don't drop your eyes necessarily from what's going on in the middle of the table or the reaction that the other players are having. And that's the experience that I wanted to have with a role-playing game. Didn't see that out there. So we built an entirely new mechanic called the stake system that's based on craps. If you've ever played the dice game craps in somebody's garage or in the corner or something along those lines, if you've ever played roulette in a casino, or if you've ever played Settlers of Catan, all three of those different games basically create one central randomizing mechanic, usually dice, but in the case of roulette, it's the ball. And you're all watching it, and one number comes up, and that single number means something different to everybody. So that's kind of this core idea, is that everybody is experiencing the same dice roll. And in Hammer and Stake and the Stake system, what you have, we're using 2d6, so the standard two six-sided dice. You throw them. We have the bell curve, right? A 7 is always a failure. And then all the other results that you can get, there are 11 other results, 2 through 12. And the better your skill in something, the more likely you're going to be successful. So it's for those of us that are used to D20 systems, right? Your success is really quite linear in that as you move up, if you've got a 15, a 16 is one pip higher, and that curve is really simple to follow. Mm-hmm. In Hammer and Stake, because we're using a bell curve out of the 2d6, there's a little bit more nuance, and it allows a little bit more gradation. So somebody that has a really high skill level will likely be able to be successful on a 6 or an 8. And somebody with a really low skill level will only be successful on a 2 or a 12. Obviously, again, when you're looking at the bell curve, the 6 and the 8 hit or resolve a lot more often than the 2 and the 12. Mm-hmm. And so the higher the skill, the more likely you are to be successful. And so there's a little bit of variation there that takes a little bit more thinking and a little bit more nuance and an approach to how you choose what skills, what actions you're going to take because of the way that the dice resolve.
So basically, there's like 2 sets of like D6 that are thrown into the middle of the table, and players can all wager on separate numbers, and those numbers are dependent on their skills, but everyone is sharing like the same die roll. They're all betting on that same roll.
Correct. And that's exactly the way to do it, right? So if you had the ability to be successful on a 3 or a 4, and I only had the success on an 8, we'd throw both. Somebody would throw the dice into the middle of the table, and we would see which one of those numbers resolves first. If neither of us are successful, there's going to be another dice roll and another dice roll until everybody is either successful or a 7 has come up and forced failure.
Okay, so can you hit on that a little bit? Because I was just about to ask, you were talking about the bell curve, and 7 is the most likely number when you're rolling 2d6, but can people bet on the 7? Or as you say, is that like a critical failure in this game?
So it's not a critical failure, it's just a failure, mm-hmm. right? So, and we explored initial rounds of allowing people to bet on 7. In other words, kind of bet that everybody was going to fail. And that felt a bit too mean-spirited, especially as I was describing. The whole idea behind the system is to try to get everybody to work together and to have a shared positive experience where successes and failures are part of the group gestalt. In a lot of ways, you're running against a 7. The 7 is eventually going to be rolled. Your hope is in each one of the dice rolls, each one of the iterations of the dice roll, one of the numbers that you were betting on comes up before 7.
Okay, and 7 is kind of like the status quo. Like the status quo wins. Yeah.
Exactly, right? So the 7, as we describe in the game, is the status quo. The status quo is 1. If the 7 comes up and you don't have your skills come out. And so that's part of the other thing that we've discovered in playtesting is there is this race against 7. There is these series of iterative dice rolls where tension builds each time. We roll the dice, and if, Kevin, neither your number nor my number come up, well, now we got to roll the dice again. And let's hope it's not a 7, but remember, the 7's the most likely one to come up. So you roll again, and you're hoping that it's not that. And maybe it came up at 3. And hey, you're successful, Kevin. You get to step away now, and it's just me and the dice. And the dice are going to roll again. And gosh, I hope that it's going to be an 8 before it is a 7. So this is building tension too. That also plays into kind of the narrative aspect of our game. When the dice are done, when everybody is either successful or has failed, then you sit around and collectively build your story. You had defined early on what you wanted to do, depending on when your dice resolved, either success or failure, tells you how much effort you had to put into being successful or not. And you work with each other and you build the scene and you explain how things evolved as a group, including the GM.
That's really awesome. So we've talked about, some of the characters, some of the factions, some of the world. Can you tell us about some of the enemies that players will be facing in the Hammer and the Stake?
Gas masks, fascists. That's the core of it, right?
Right to the core of it.
You're going to be facing, you probably are not going to face Dracula. And if you do, I want to hear about that game and I'm going to celebrate it. But in general, you're going to be facing the minions of the cryptocracy, whether it's the Gerer-Makek, which are the vampires that have been created by Dracula and serve as Dracula's lieutenants and ministers within the government, or you're going to be fighting against sycophants, humans that have betrayed their humanity in an effort for temporal power and creature comforts, the simple things in life that they desperately want, and they're willing to sacrifice the rest of humanity in for it. And then you're going to be working against mages and sorcerers who are working to harness the worst parts of the human nature and capitalism itself. And then in some cases, the challenges that you're going to face are going to be the environment itself. Fear has a specific mechanic here that infuses the land, and it changes and it warps the land. So the worse things get, the more successful the cryptocracy gets, the worse the land becomes, and it creates specific monsters that will arise if that fear is not confronted by your characters. And that's where we have things like the Lumpenproll, which we've given a bit of a supernatural bent to, which are basically supernatural economic zombies.
Once again, the metaphors kind of play with themselves, huh?
They really do, right? That was part of the fun of building this game, is the research into early socialist thought and moving beyond Marx into a whole host of other socialist thinkers, really interesting people, and the thoughts that they had about what modernity and history and how all those things came together, and the nuanced arguments that people made, right? Like a lot of socialists, when you get into it, a lot of them saw capitalism not necessarily as a horrible thing, but as only one step towards a better and brighter future, and feudalism being farther back behind that. And these really interesting nuanced arguments that I was able to, with the other writers, kind of explore and then put into mechanics that you get to as players as well, kind of explore the different factions and ideologies, and how do we operationalize that in these terms of dice rolls that give you certain powers and benefits, or give the enemies and the antagonists certain powers and benefits.
Speaking of looking toward the future, what are some of the future plans for the Hammer and the Stake?
We have supplements. Like every good role-playing game, we have supplements coming out. I'm finishing up editing the introductory adventure, which we're going to get out to all of our backers and to everybody else that's able to go on DriveThruRPG and get it. I'm in the midst of finishing up the edit for a book on anarchists. So in the future, the core book is all about socialists. We're going to introduce the opportunity to play anarcho-syndicalists or nihilists or other types of anarchists and introduce and inject them into the socialist circle. And what does that do to the very delicate balance that you have with all of your compatriots at the table? In many ways, anarchists and socialists come from the same philosophical background, but have diverged. And so that's exactly what we're trying to explore with the anarchist supplement, is this idea for somebody to sit down to bring some very new, powerful abilities to the table, but to be just a little bit disruptive. Mm-hmm. And I say a little bit because I don't like disruptive types of characters. I love special snowflake characters that allow everybody to celebrate and everybody to build on it and everybody tell a more rich story. I don't like characters that their mechanics are specifically so special snowflakey that they disrupt the entire table. So that's where a lot of our playtesting is really focused, is how do we do this and understand that the anarchists and socialists come from the shared background, but have ultimately a different vision for what the future should be, and how does that manifest in the mechanics. And so we've got the anarchist book that I'm editing and will be one of the first ones out, hopefully this year.
I gotta say, I love the idea of an anarchist expansion, by the way. The first thing that comes to my mind, though, is like the player who takes the anarchist class is like, once per session, you can jump over the table and punch the GM in the face. No rules!
Yeah. We did not introduce that particular mechanic.
You didn't introduce physical violence into the game,
We didn't, but like with the anarchists, we did introduce this anarchist die. So we were just talking all about how the 2d6 and you throw it and everybody shares it. Well, the anarchist player gets to, before the game ever starts, roll a special d6, and they actually do get to hoard it. And then at some point, they are able to replace one of the dice that was rolled with their own die, or one of their dice that was rolled with one of their specific pip that they rolled. And if they're doing that, it's been neat to watch like the reaction, right? In some cases, people are going to want to see it, right? If the anarchist die changes it to that 4 that Kevin, you desperately wanted to roll, but it changes it away from the 8 that I just rolled and I really wanted. There's this conversation that goes on at the table. What are you doing? Why are you doing this? And there's this really interesting, fun negotiation. And that was one of the other principles to the mechanics at the core of Hammer and Stake, but then also with the introduction of anarchists, is this conversation that we wanted to promote around the table. Most of it hopefully productive, but there are going to be disagreements, and there's going to be friction sometimes between the players. And this is one of those specific opportunities, but it is an opportunity, for the anarchists to kind of throw a little bit of a spanner in the works, but then also potentially to be really, really helpful. It's just how they play that die. And then we've also got a supplement that's coming out on werewolves, because if we're going to be doing vampires, well, we're gonna damn well have to do werewolves as well.
Almost legally obligated to add in werewolves into a vampire game.
Well, especially if you're setting it in Eastern Europe, right? And in Hungary and Romania, and these deep, rich traditions. And I've been exploring these traditions with my Hungarian Romanian friends and exploring and challenging what the concepts were and how can we introduce them. But then also, how does the idea of a werewolf play out? What does the werewolf bring to the table philosophically, right? So it's not just about having a cool werewolf as a bad guy. What does the werewolf represent in the greater setting? And so what we were talking about is what it's evolved into is werewolves, where vampires are all about taking. They're about literally blood sucking, right? Like taking the blood out of a normal human, feeding off of that, taking, capitalist institutions, taking gold, taking resources, taking this all to make themselves. Like, so there's this greed aspect to vampires. For werewolves, it's obsession. And so when werewolves get introduced, and it's not healthy obsession, it's the type of really destructive obsession that can come about. But again, I was mentioning how fear pervades the world. So what happens when you've got a physical manifestation of fear, actually, in the village and changing people. And then you get this individual who has refused to fall to despair, but is completely consumed by anger. And what does that say? So one of the things that I like that I like really about Hammer and Stake is when we introduce a new type of challenge, when you introduce a new antagonist or anything along those lines, in the future, it is always going to be with an eye towards what is the type of story this individual is telling about the setting. Not necessarily just only about the type of story that your characters will be able to build by interacting with them, but just by GM introducing them into the setting. What is that telling the players about the setting? What are they learning about the setting? So when a werewolf comes into it, there's an entirely new aspect of greater Hungary that will be opened up. And these philosophical kind of core questions about what does it mean to be angry and to want to break everything when it grows out of control.
Dang. That's all I can say to that, honestly. Once you start getting into like the broader meaning of werewolves in this setting, I could tell like there's a lot of exciting things coming to Hammer and the Stake. So we talked a lot about the future, but let's talk a little bit about the present. Chris, where is the Hammer and the Stake currently available?
Drive-through RPG. So we'll make sure to have the link, the URL up there so that we can get people there. And I will say, if anybody's listening to this and is interested, we've got two versions. We've got just a quick start out there for just a handful of dollars. It can get you this full quick start. It gets you all the core rules. It can get you starting to play. And then there's the full rule book that's a bit more. That's also going to be introducing all of the setting. And there is a lot of setting there. There's a lot of stuff to really, if you'll excuse the metaphor, but dig your teeth into. So the vision here was to try to make the entry into Hammer and Stake as easy as possible. So if only one person really wanted to buy the core book, fine. You're going to miss out on the setting. But if you really want to run it, make it as easy as possible for the other players to also get into it. And that's where the quick start, the player's guide stuff comes into it. You can just spend a couple extra dollars and you get a very nicely laid out PDF that you'll have access to and gives you all the basic core rules and can get you playing almost immediately.
Well, you heard it here first, folks. Check out the link in the description to check out the Hammer and the Stake on Drive-Thru RPG, both the core rulebook and the Quick Start Player's Guide. Be sure to subscribe to this channel for more news on the Hammer and the Stake, and also subscribe to Weaponized Ink's social media. All those links will be in the description as well. Chris, thank you so much for joining me today. This was such a pleasure to talk about this game. And thank you for joining me, by the way, all the way in Ghana, correct?
Yeah, that's my home is in Ghana. I really do appreciate it. You can tell, but I love this game. I don't think it's getting enough attention. And this opportunity to sit and talk about the reasons behind the game, the motivations, and I really genuinely appreciate it. So thank you very much, Kevin.
Of course, of course. For those of you watching, if you want to start fighting fascist vampires, check out the Hammer and the Stake today. See you in the new dawn.